So yeah, hi everyone. Welcome to Faces and Places, LGBTQ plus history in Boston's West End. This is a collaboration between the History Project and the West End Museum. My name is Matisse Dupont, and I am the programs coordinator for the History Project. In case anyone is new here to the History Project, welcome. We are Boston's LGBTQ plus community archives. We are dedicated to documenting, preserving, and sharing Boston's queer history. So if you are at all interested in the LGBTQ plus history of Boston at all, please feel free to follow us on social media. You can learn about all sorts of upcoming events. We've got some tours at some like historical houses. We've got a book club. We've got some Gothic literature things. We've got a tour of different Boston Public Library events. We're going to be celebrating the 20th anniversary of marriage equality in Massachusetts. We've got a lot of events. Probably one of the best ways is follow us on social media. You can go to our Instagram. From there, you can find our link tree. You can subscribe to our newsletter. Maybe you're already on our newsletter. I do want to tell you about one initiative we've got going on right now. It's our community-generated history of marriage equality in Massachusetts. And we're doing this to celebrate the 20th anniversary of marriage equality passing here. This initiative is called Honey, Let's Get Married. And we've created an online forum where everyone is invited to share the memories of their LGBTQ plus wedding stories, photographs, invitations, vows, audio recordings, videos, any sort of document, and any other item from the last 20 years. I'm putting a link in the chat right here. So if you go and you follow this link, the historyproject.org/marriage, you can see instructions on uploading things. We're actually right now looking for photos. So if anyone has gotten gay married in the last 20 years since Massachusetts passed marriage equality, please share with us those photos. We're looking to build up our community's archive so we have them for posterity. But also we're accepting any sort of oral histories. If you have the document with your vows, if you've got invitations, we want to see it all, but especially photos. If you've got photos from any sort of LGBTQ marriage, please submit them. And my final plug before we pass it on over to the West End Museum is just to thank you all again for your support and ask for your help. So as a community archives that is funded by the community, any donation to the History Project directly supports our mission to document, preserve, and share LGBTQ plus history. So we're actually just got a really special a collaboration with the ZACM Fund. We're doing something called Pride 365. It's our campaign to preserve, protect, and share queer history every single day. And this LGBTQ plus History Month, we have a powerful opportunity to make double the impact. So we're partnering with the Lenny ZACM Fund, and they are matching every dollar that new donors donate up to $2,500. So if you've been coming to History Project events and you haven't donated yet, this is a wonderful time to do so because the ZACM Fund is doubling your dollars and it's making it go even further. And if you already are a donor to the History Project, thank you so much, by the way. This is a great chance for you to increase your support, and any current donors who give more than what they've given before, that is also being matched by the ZACM Fund. So please, if you have anything to give to help support preserving, protecting, and sharing queer history in Boston, give to our Pride 365 campaign and make your dollars go double. Okay, enough spieling. Now on to tonight's event. It is my pleasure to introduce to Grace Clipson from the West End Museum. Grace, I'm going to pull you up. Why don't you tell us a bit more about the West End Museum, what you all are up to, and give a great introduction to our speaker of the night, Emma. Tell us, yeah, it's all you.
I'm unmuted now. Absolutely. So I'm Grace. I'm the education manager for the West End Museum. We are a local history museum that shares and preserves the history of the West End neighborhood in Boston. We focus both on the history of the neighborhood as well as urban studies issues related to the neighborhood as well, given the displacement of the people in the neighborhood beginning in 1958. We also act as a community space for both former and present residents of the West End neighborhood. We have a bunch of great events coming up in the next month. I just dropped a link in the chat feature that goes over all our upcoming events. We have lots of Halloween featured events, from Halloween walking tours to pumpkin paint and sips to history of the spooky West End Museum coming up soon for October, as well as just after on November 10th, we are going to be having a concert that's free and open to the public that is a live orchestra performance that responds to immigration in the West End. So that's just a little bit about us coming up. But more importantly, I wanted to be here to introduce Emma. Emma was our fabulous intern over the summer alongside the Reckoning Project. She is a master's student at Northeastern University. She is working on her public history master's degree, and over the summer, she very diligently researched LGBTQ plus history in the West End neighborhood, which is not something that we had been able to devote a lot of resources to prior to Emma coming on board to do that. So we're very grateful to Emma and all the work she's been doing, not just researching LGBTQ plus history in the West End, but also turning that into articles and tours to be able to share that with our visitors and members as well. So without further ado, I wanted to pass things over to Emma to take us on this virtual tour of LGBTQ plus history in the West End. So thank you, Emma.
Yeah,
Hi,
everyone give it up for Emma in the chat.
get this open. La, la, la. All right, I think we've got slides up there. So let's get started. I will try to keep this snappy because I've got a lot of stuff to go over, but I know we've only got a short amount of time here today. Thanks all for coming. I'm Emma. As Grace said, I'm a public history master's student at Northeastern University, and I did research for the West End Museum this summer on LGBTQ plus history in the West End. So just to start off here, we've got this nice little photo of the West End. This tour began as a walking tour where we did leave the museum and head out into the neighborhood. Obviously, we can't do that online, but I've tried to keep as much of the ethos of a walking tour preserved through this slideshow here. So let's get started. Now, to start off here, I just want to go over quickly what it means to be the West End. Where is the West End? The West End in Boston is this highlighted pink area. That's the historic boundary. The location of the West End Museum, where we would have started this tour, is highlighted in that little dot. And the neighborhood we're going to cover today is the north slope of Beacon Hill, which is that little box down on the bottom. Now, you may be wondering, why are we talking about Beacon Hill if we are in the West End? And we will get to that in a minute here. But first, some history of the West End. On the left here, we've got this early map of Boston, and what is now the West End was made up of the Mill Pond and then that sort of empty area up in the top there. The West End was first settled by a guy named William Blackston, who moved in where the indigenous population of Shawmut Peninsula had been living. He put his house right on the top of Beacon Hill, which was a nice place for him to live, but was a steep hill down to a big marsh, so not maybe the best for the city to expand into. So as you can see, there was not a lot of housing out there otherwise. On the right-hand side, we've got this map that shows Boston in 1883, when the Mill Pond had been filled in with part of the land of Beacon Hill, so that made it a little bit flatter out there. Not flat, we're going to still hike up a hill today, but a little bit larger of an area for the West End to fill in. In 1883 and around this time period, the West End was going from being a majority Black population, maybe not majority, a significant Black population, full of free and formerly enslaved Black people who came and found the West End and the North Slope to be particularly welcoming. And it was transitioning into this immigrant neighborhood where they had many people from Ireland, Italy, Eastern Europe, and other countries settling into this area. Now, after this, we go from the community you can see on the left to the empty lots you can see on the right as urban renewal arrived in Boston in the late 1950s. The tenement buildings and other houses were all claimed by eminent domain by the city of Boston and demolished. I've highlighted the white building. It is called the White Building. It's not just a white building, of Massachusetts General Hospital in both of these photos. So you can see really how much the neighborhood had changed in that short period of time. Now, because of this urban renewal in this neighborhood, we chose for my research to focus on the pre-renewal period. So we're primarily going to be talking about the 1850s-ish to the 1950s-ish. And that will influence a lot of how we talk about what we're going to talk about today. Now, here I've highlighted again where you can see Beacon Hill and the North Slope, which is what we're going to talk about. To clarify, until 1963, the North Slope was included in the geopolitical boundaries of the West End neighborhood. In 1962, Beacon Hill had been declared a National Historic Landmark, and the year afterward, they absorbed the North Slope into their protected area because they didn't want to see it demolished the way that the neighborhood around them and across Cambridge Street had been demolished in the years before. And this has to do a lot with how we perceive the neighborhood today and how it would have been perceived in the time that these people we're going to talk about today experienced the neighborhood. Was it more how we think of Beacon Hill today, or was it more immigrant community? We'll see. And now lastly, just before we get into the specific stops and people we're going to talk about today, just want to go over very quickly what we mean by LGBTQ+. I know most of you will probably be familiar with this term, but for anyone who's not, we're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and plus sign to indicate the limitless sexual orientations and gender expressions used by members of the community. Now, many of the people we're going to talk about maybe did not use those exact terminology for themselves, and I'm going to try to use the words that people used for themselves as much as possible as we're discussing them today. Some of the words may not be the words we prefer today, and I will stay away from any, offensive language. But the point being, I want to make sure we're true to how these people would have talked about themselves. So, where are we going to go? I've zoomed in here on this little section of the North Slope and highlighted if we were actually on a tour around this neighborhood, where we would go and take a look at. These are all the street names that you would find there today. Now, Joy Street is the one farthest to the right. Hopefully you can see it might be underneath the screens for you there, but Joy Street is a steep hill. If we were really walking up there today, it would be a big climb up to our first stop. So imagine yourself, if you will, hiking right up that hill or wheeling or however you would have gotten up there to 36 Joy Street, which is our first stop here today. But before we get started with each of these people, just want to go over the sort of slide setup so that you can make sure you're not lost as we're talking here. I've got a photo of the building as it stands today. Underneath it, you can see that little map, and that you can follow along with as we're hiking around the hill here virtually. And then we've got who we're talking about, when we're talking about them, and some pictures just to keep it interesting. So we're going to start here with the Barn Theater and Prescott Townsend, who is that man in the raccoon skin coat there. Prescott Townsend was born on June 24th, 1894. He came out to his family at age 19. Later in life, he described it as coming out as gay, though whether he used that term in 1913 remains to be seen. His family, who were a Boston Brahmin family, were generally accepting, but they did caution him not to do anything that would sully the family name. But they weren't so concerned about what that activity would be, just that he shouldn't embarrass them. He attended Harvard University from 1914 to 1917 when he enlisted in the Navy Reserves. But he was awarded a degree as completing his studies in 1918. He was an avid traveler, and he joined the Harvard Travelers Club. With them, he went to Paris in 1920. He became really enamored with the bohemian, lost generation culture of Paris at the time. And so when he returned to Boston, he really wanted to bring that with him. To do that, he decided he was going to purchase this building you can see here, the Barn Theater, and he ended up turning this into a theater company and theater show here where you could go and watch performances put on. They were really interested in experimental productions here and doing things that weren't just the ordinary. And then this lot, it's a little bit hard to see in this picture, but if you go through the gate there on the left, there's a bunch of outbuildings back there, which he rented out to artist studios and other shops, including the Brick Oven Tea Room, which was a speakeasy. You could also go and get dance lessons or buy books, get costumes. You could always pick up a dinner of chicken and waffles at the Saracen's Head restaurant if you wanted. Now, sadly, he did have to sell this property because of the crash in 1929. It was not to remain a long-serving venture, but from this photo taken in the 70s, he's outside the theater and clearly had taken whoever this photographer was on this walk through the hill. This was clearly a very important site to him for the rest of his life. I think I'd like to imagine, at least at this location, that whatever he was doing, he was wearing that lovely raccoon skin coat. Now, we're gonna take a walk right up the hill here to our next location, 11 Pinckney Street. This is where a woman named Alice Brown lived. She's there on the left. She lived at 11 Pinckney Street in around the 1890s. She was a novelist. Her first novel was called Stratford by the Sea. It came out in 1884. She had what has been called an intense emotional relationship with a woman named Louise Imogen Guinea, who you can see on the right there. She was a poet. She did not live at this address, but she did visit here very often. She wrote her first poetry collection that came out in 1884, and it was called Songs at the Start. She's best known for her work A Roadside Harp, which came out in 1893. Now, Louise Imogen Guinea moved to Oxford, England in 1901, but her relationship with Brown lasted throughout her time in London until her death in, I believe, 1920. And when she died, Alice Brown wrote a long tribute to her. And so clearly their relationship stayed very important to both women throughout their lives. The other thing that I thought was sort of fun about Alice Brown and Louise Imogen Guinea was that they came together to start a group called the Women's Rest Tour Association in 1891. They founded this with their friends Maria Gilman Reed and Anna Cleveland Murdoch. And they founded this organization in order to support single women traveling alone, especially abroad, which all of them had done before in their lives. They wanted to make sure that they could make good suggestions for women to travel when they were unprotected, as it were, from seduction primarily by men. But of course, the added bonus of this was that women could maybe travel with other young women and be safe and not questioned in what they were doing here. So a little added bonus to their relationship there. Now, Louise Imogen Guinea, as we know, was very closely attached to Alice Brown. But we've also seen letters that show an attachment to F. Holland Day, who lived right next door at 9 Pinckney Street. Now, as I was doing research here, this became a little bit of a muddy water situation, only because I found in a lot of scholarly research that there was a strongly held belief that F. Holland Day and Louise Imogen Guinea were definitely romantically attached, but that Day was impotent, and that meant that they couldn't be together. And so a lot of researchers kind of decided, I guess that's it. We're not going to really look into F. Holland Day's other relationships. But I think he's sort of an interesting fellow, and I thought it would be good to include him here, even if we can't really make a lot of definitive statements about him, or at least about his sexuality. Now, F. Holland Day here was born in 1864. He was raised in Norwood, Massachusetts, which is just outside Dedham, if you're familiar with the area. I'm not familiar. In 1888, he began to volunteer at the Parmenter Street Settlement House, which is in the north end of Boston. Settlement houses, which were also very important in the history of the West End, spaces where primarily immigrants could get together with people from the same country as them and figure out how to get used to living in a new place. They provide a lot of resources for community and activities to get, settled in a new country. They were big in these immigrant neighborhoods, which tended to also be rather relatively poor areas. And so having that support system in place was very important. Now, in 1889, F. Holland Day did begin to call Louise Imogen Guiney mother in his letters. And so that does add a bit of a question to exactly what their relationship may have been. Louise also called him son in return, but sure, they were definitely romantically involved, and nothing, no other questions can be asked here. Now, F. Holland Day was also a member of the Visionists, which was a cult-like group that was based on the Hill here. They were really into medieval tradition, theosophy, aestheticism, and they were led by a guy named Ralph Adams Cram. He lived on the Hill here as well. In 1893, F. Holland Day founded a publishing firm with his friend Herbert Copeland. F. Holland Day was really interested in rare books. He had purchased a Kelmscott Press Chaucer as well as a Kelmscott Press Keats, which was one of 7 copies printed on vellum at the time. So already he's very interested in both the rare and collectability of books, and also the aesthetics. Kelmscott was really interested in making sure that not just the contents of the book were beautiful, but also how it was presented. And so Copeland and Day wanted their press to be a similar sort of situation. They were helped by the International Copyright Act, which had been passed in 1891, which meant that they had to purchase rights to publish books that had been printed abroad originally. And so their partnership with John Lane of the Bodley Head in England really helped them in this way. They were able to more easily acquire rights to books like The Yellow Book, which included lots of drawings from Aubrey Beardsley, and Oscar Wilde's Salome, which came out in 1894 in translation. The publication history of that book is very complicated, and I won't get into many of the details here, but suffice to say that it is described often as satanic sensualism, and it was locked up in the Boston Public Library, and you had to request special access to it. So not a book that you would have just found on the streets at this point. And they wanted to include works like that in their press and make sure that they were being presented in America. They sought out authors who played with conventional imagery, including Louise Imogen Guiney's works, which included lots of Catholic imagery in kind of a subversive way. And just as an aside note here, we're not talking about F. Holland Day in particular, but Herbert Copeland, we know, had intimate relationships with other men. He had a reputation for pursuing married men, and he described these interests in letters to F. Holland Day. So whether or not we can say specifically about what F. Holland Day himself preferred, he definitely was around and in company with gay men. Now, F. Holland Day moved into this particular studio apartment in 9 Pinckney in 1894. Copeland and Day folded in 1899, and that was when F. Holland Day could take on the role of photographer more full-time. He had been dabbling in it a little bit beforehand, but he was really able to jump on that career as a career in 1899. Day was a pictorialist photographer, so he was really interested in creating photos that looked like paintings, and not just recreations of real life exactly as it was. He would do this through set dressing and costuming, and he would also manipulate the plates that the photos were printed on after they had been, taken. Some photographers you might be more familiar with, and we'll get to why that is, are Alfred Stieglitz and Edward Steichen, who were both friends and rivals with F. Holland Day at this time. Now, especially early in his career, F. Holland Day was really interested in using religious imagery. So you can see here, this is F. Holland Day posing as Christ for his probably best known work, which I've chosen to go with the title, The 7 Words, though I've heard other titles put out there as well. He also took the photo of Louise Imogen Guiney that we saw a couple slides ago, where she's posing as Saint Barbara. Now, F. Holland Day held a viewing party at his apartment at 9 Pinckney Street in November 1898, where he invited friends, acquaintances, and nuns, even from Louisburg Square, to come to his apartment and tell him what they thought of photos like this one. And it was largely positive reception. Most people thought it was fine and dandy what he was doing. But it is a common misconception that this event included a photo called nude, or sometimes study for the crucifixion. It's likely that that photo was not actually there. It's a male nude, and the lore is that this was the first male nude photograph ever put on public display in Boston. From what I found in my research, I don't think that's true that that photo was there, but the story behind it is still very interesting. So I'll tell you a little bit about that one as well. I haven't included it in the slides, but you're welcome to take a look on Google if you want to see it. Now, to go back in time just briefly here, F. Holland Day had a friendship with a young man named Jack Bemis when they were young. Jack Bemis was married in 1887, and Day described the event in his diary and in letters as though Jack Bemis had died. F. Holland Day acknowledged that it left him absolutely bereft, and they did not speak again after the marriage happened. So whatever that means. Now, the model for nude was a young man named Thomas Langrel Harris, who posed for the photo probably in 1898 or 1899. And he's described in contemporary letters as a handsome girl masquerading as a boy. F. Holland Day's sexuality or masculinity had also been questioned by his grandfather when he was a child. His grandfather thought that he played inside with girls and dolls too much and not enough outside with boys. Now, F. Holland Day and Thomas Langrel Harris both lived in 9 Pinckney Street together for a short period of time, but a significant one in both of their lives. They shared the space as a studio, as F. Holland Day worked on his photography, and Thomas Langrel Harris was a painter of miniatures. Now, sadly, Harris died by suicide 1 year later at 24 years old in Paris. But Day marked the date of his death in his diary for the rest of his life, using the same notation as he used for the death of Keats, the death of his father, and the death of Louise Imogen Guinea. So that really goes to show what level they were all on in his life and as he saw them as being important to him. Now, in 1901, F. Holland Day chose to move his studio to a building called the Harcourt Building on Irvington Street. This ended up being an absolutely terrible decision for Day, as that building burned down in 1904. It ended up destroying Day's entire collection of negatives, prints, and his personal art collection, which included dozens of drawings by Aubrey Beardsley, and it destroyed all of the miniatures that he had by Harris left. But, life on Pinckney, as sad as that was, life on Pinckney did have to go on. He was known for throwing baked bean dinners on Saturday nights at this apartment. And a friend, Herbert A. Hess, wrote to Day in 1909, "Many are the pleasant evenings I had there, never to return again, apparently. I told Brother Copeland you should have had a Dr. Watson to place the Chronicles of Number 9 in enduring print. He thought, sometimes the truth is better left unsaid. Nevertheless, the walls, doubtless, if they could speak, could tell some interesting tales." By 1909, F. Holland Day was living primarily in Maine and in Norwood. But that brings us to the Costanza family here. Day was really interested in using diverse models for his photos, and he did go out into the neighborhoods around Pinckney Street to find these models. As we said before, he was interested not just in recreating real life, but showing these stories from mythology, from religion, or from history. In a triptych called Armageddon that he produced in 1898, he featured a Black man in the role of Christ on Judgment Day. And he was also known for helping the less fortunate, including Khalil Gibran, who he mentored in his early art career. This also included this family, who are the Costanzas of the West End. Here's a little bit about who they were. Pasquale and Conchetta Costanza emigrated in 1881 with their baby son Enrico. They moved between the North End and the West End of Boston, kind of back and forth for a good 20 years until they settled on Lyman Street, which is that dot on the right there. In that time, they had 8 more children: Vincenzo, Maria, Amato, Armelindo, Pasquale Jr., Ciriaco, Antonio, and Giuseppe. Pasquale Sr. was a shoemaker, and his son Vincenzo worked for him at least briefly. And the other boys are listed on census records as errand boys and newspaper boys, showing that they are really interested in augmenting the family income, making sure that they could afford to live in the West End at this point in time. It's not really clear how they might have met F. Hollanday, but he did spend Christmas dinner with them on Lyman Street in their house in 1903. And the next summer, Pasquale Jr., who's known as Pucky and is the boy on the far left there, and his mother Conchetta did visit F. Hollanday in Maine the next summer. After that, the Costanzas, especially the youngest 4 boys you can see here from left to right, that's Pasquale Jr., Ciriaco, known as Chuggy, Antonio, known as Tony, and Giuseppe, known as Pippi, all visited Maine regularly and also would write to F. Hollanday very regularly for advice, including asking for his approval of a girlfriend or, seeking out his advice if they felt they needed help or, had gotten into a jam. They wanted him to tell them what to do. And these would have been really valuable getaways for them as well. The fact that the boys were able to leave the West End. They lived in this, at this address, 27 Lyman Street, all 8 children at that point. They'd lost a couple, but all 8 children, their parents, and Enrico, the eldest son, had 4 children and a wife himself, who all lived at this address, which was not uncommon for the West End, but you can imagine how cramped the quarters must have been. F. Hollanday took lots of pictures of them. Often they're pictured in these sailor suits that you can see. I would say the 2 on the left are wearing the sailor suits here. F. Hollanday would require that all the children who came to visit him, to wear these sailor suits, both because of practical reasons, they're playing on the beach and in the dirt, and you don't want to get your normal clothes all dirty, but also because it would be a neutralizer, as he invited both his wealthier friends to come and visit, as well as boys like the Costanza family. He wanted to make sure that no one felt left out or more privileged because of their clothing, as an obvious indicator here. Now, photographs of Chuggy and Pucky in sailor suits did get exhibited at the Spencer Kellogg studio in Buffalo, New York in 1914. And so it's sort of interesting to think still that F. Hollanday was viewing these photos as art objects, not just photos to take for posterity. But the Costanza family themselves kept every photo that F. Hollanday took in family scrapbook albums. The brothers always described their relationship with F. Hollanday as like that of an uncle and his nephews. So definitely a very important figure in all of their lives. Just as a side note, since we were talking about urban renewal, as far as I can tell, the Costanzas all left the West End, or at least the demolished parts of the West End, by the 1950s. So they were not affected as directly by urban renewal at that point. Now, just to wrap up on Day here very quickly, World War I was very devastating for Day's photographic career. Platinum, which he used for his photographic plates, became really expensive, and he had to take care of his elderly mother. So he essentially gave up photography at this point. He became somewhat of a recluse at the end of his life, but he did keep up correspondence, including with the Costanza boys, until his death in November 1933. I'm gonna skip over the next part and talk about it at the very end of the presentation. So we'll come back to that. But first, we'll move on. As we walked down Pinckney Street, I always think it's fun to mention Louisa May Alcott, since she did live there for a brief period of time. She lived on Pinckney Street at number 20 from 1852 to 1855. Her bedroom was on the third floor. Her first story, The Rival Painters, A Tale of Rome, was published while she lived here, as well as her first novel, which is called Flower Fables. I've included her here on this tour because there's been a lot of talk about what Louisa May Alcott's gender might have been, whether she was a woman or not, or something else. Alcott scholar Gregory Iselin describes her as not fitting the binary sex gender model. She preferred to be called Lou or Louie. She referred to herself as Papa or Uncle to her nephews. And Bronson Alcott, her father, described her as his only son. There's some speculation that maybe the beliefs of the transcendentalists who surrounded her in especially childhood and as she was growing up may have been influential on how she perceived her gender. They believed that humans were spirits in a particular physical form and that gender was impermanent and flexible and not necessarily tied to that human form. When she was interviewed in 1883, she said, "I am more than half persuaded that I am a man's soul put by some freak of nature into a woman's body, because I have fallen in love in my life with so many pretty girls and never the once the least bit with a man." Now, obviously, I've been using she, her pronouns this whole time, which is a whole other debate about literary canon and how we talk about people. But I like to think that at least there's some room for more exploration of Louisa May Alcott and her presence on the Hill here as well. So that's just a brief happy aside to Louisa May Alcott as we travel farther down the hill here and talk about F.O. Matheson. So Francis Otto Matheson was born in 1902 in Pasadena, California. He went to Yale. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University in England. He went to graduate school at Harvard, where he graduated in 1928. In 1924, he met Russell Cheney, who you can see in the photograph on the right. He's the one on the left in the right-hand photograph. They met on the ocean liner Paris as they were both traveling to England. Matheson was going back to school at Oxford, and Russell Cheney was headed off to paint. He was an artist. This was not Matheson's first gay experience, but it was the one that convinced him that he could achieve happiness for his lifetime with a male partner. Cheney was 20 years older than Matheson, which was a big factor in their relationship, but they became very close very quickly. In a letter from 1925, F.O. Matheson described their relationship as intimate and all-embracing. The central fact remains that Cheney and I are so constituted by nature that our two lives and personalities have blended into a harmony of understanding affection, which brings us each closer to the other than we have ever been to anyone else. I did not know that life contained anything so right and deep. They made their primary residence in Kittery in Maine when they were here. But Matheson did come into Boston to work at Harvard, which is where he worked for the rest of his life. So they were in and out of the city pretty regularly. It was in fact Russell Cheney who pushed F.O. Matheson toward 19th century American literature, which is what became his sort of life's work and what you might know him for now as a literary critic. He was very private in his work at Harvard University. He knew that if he were to come out at work, he would risk demotion or being fired or worse. But in his work and his literary scholarship, he did write about a lot of people that are now the subject of queer studies, including people like Walt Whitman, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville, Henry and Alice James, and Sarah Orne Jewett. He also wrote the tribute book to Russell Cheney once Russell Cheney passed away. This tribute is sort of shallowly or thinly disguised as sort of, that their relationship was not so intimate as it definitely was. But you can really tell as you look through the letters that it is a very intimate and tender relationship. Now, the other big thing in Matheson's life at this point was that he was a socialist, but that he could express more openly than his sexuality. For example, in the 1930s, he canvassed the North End on the socialist ticket. In May 1940, he was elected leader of the Harvard Teachers Union. In 1948, he gave the second speech for Harry Wallace's progressive campaign for president. Harry Wallace was the vice president of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. and thought that he needed to be more progressive even than that. And in 1949, F.O. Matheson, participated in a panel on writing and publishing that was chaired by W.E.B. Du Bois and attended by over 800 people at the Cultural and Scientific Conference for World Peace in New York, which was an event that was criticized by Life magazine at the time. And F.O. Matheson in particular was called out as maybe being too socialist. Now, this was at a time when Senator McCarthy was claiming that homosexuals were vulnerable to the socialist and communist agenda because they could be blackmailed. But F.O. Matheson was always very adamant that he was making a conscious choice to be a socialist and follow his socialist beliefs. All right, that brings us to how did Matheson end up here? On December 26, 1938, he was hospitalized for a nervous breakdown. He was in the midst of working on his best-known work, American Renaissance, Art and Expression in the Age of Emerson and Whitman, which did come out in 1941. It was while hospitalized that he had his first suicidal ideation of falling or jumping to his death. Luckily, he was discharged from this first hospitalization on January 13th, 1939. And Chaney and Matheson moved immediately into a house on Mount Vernon Street, and then shortly afterward to this house at 87 Pinckney, where they both remained for the rest of their lives. F.O. Matheson had previously lived when he was in Boston at Eliot House on Harvard's campus. He was the sort of faculty in-house professor there. But obviously Chaney could not live with him, not the least because Chaney was not associated with Harvard University, but also because that would have been, maybe some questions that they did not want to have to face and answer at that time. So they moved here, where they could be both away from the pressures of Harvard, but not so far away from Boston that they were isolated up in Maine. Many of F.O. Matheson's colleagues at Harvard also lived nearby on the Hill. And so they seemed to settle into life here. They first moved into a lower floor, but eventually moved up to the top floor so that they could have access to the roof for their cats. And eventually F.O. Matheson went on to buy the entire building. They were known for hosting Christmas parties here, and Harry Levin, a friend and colleague from Harvard, later reflected that they could live more openly here than anywhere before. Friends who knew about their relationship were nearby on the Hill and could, socialize together in a comfortable and safer than if they were at Harvard campus way. Now, sadly, on June 12th, 1945, Chaney died quite suddenly while up in Kittery in Maine. He had been struggling with alcoholism for much of his life and spending a lot of time away from Matheson at this point. F.O. Matheson had always been very worried because Chaney was so much older than him that he would die first, and was worried about what would happen, and it caused a lot of stress in their lives. And this was not lessened, obviously, by his passing suddenly. And Matheson also could not publicly grieve his loss. He would not have been given off time at the university as if it were a wife who had passed away, and he couldn't, claim the full extent of their relationship in public. He did not feel comfortable doing that. But he did continue to live here until 1950. In 1950, on March 31st, 1950, he checked in at the Hotel Manger, which is in the West End. I put this map here on the slide so you can get a little bit of a sense of scale of the distance. The former site of the Hotel Manger is directly across the street from the West End Museum today. So when we started our tour, we would have been right outside there, and we would have taken the walk all the way to 87 Pinckney, which really gives you an idea of exactly how far away they are from each other. So I've tried to replicate that as well as possible with this map and the 2 points on it here. It's thought that he might have picked the Hotel Manger both because it was right at North Station, which is where you would have gone to get on a train to go to Maine, and it could have held some symbolic importance to F.O. Matheson, but also claimed that he saw this maybe as being far away from his neighbors on Beacon Hill and in a separate neighborhood, even though, as we said, the borders of the West End included F.O. Matheson's house on Pinckney Street in the West End, the same neighborhood as where the Hotel Manger was. So what does it mean that he maybe saw this as a different neighborhood? Would it have been demographics? Would he have been hearing the chatter about the West End being more of a slum and not conceiving, his neighborhood where all of his Harvard colleagues lived? Well, that wasn't a slum. That wasn't like the rest of the West End. So it was far away, even though it's only a few blocks. It's not a long walk to get from 87 Pinckney Street to the Hotel Manger. Now, that night, which is March 31st, 1950, F.O. Matheson dined with his friend Kenneth Murdoch on the Hill and then returned to the hotel room where he died by suicide just after midnight when he fell or was pushed from his room on the 12th story of the building. A note found in his hotel room claimed that he was driven to suicide over the state of the world. It's also thought that maybe vitriol over his leftist politics and all the implications about his sexuality that came with that also influenced his decision. Regardless, his work remains highly influential, especially on literary folks such as Walt Whitman, T.S. Eliot, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and William and Henry James, as we said before, though he is rightly criticized for excluding women, authors of color, and anyone who lived outside New England at this point in time. He did cement many queer-leaning American authors into the global literary canon at this point in time. So there we are with F.O. Matheson. Here's where the walking tour gets a little bit convoluted. If we were really taking a walk around the North Slope here, we would not be stopping at 148 Charles Street because there isn't really anything there to look at. It's now a parking garage, but back in time, it was a lovely house, which is where James T. Fields and Annie Adams Fields lived. Annie, in this photo, you can see she's on the right there. They were married in 1854. James T. Fields worked at Ticknor and Fields. He was an editor at the Atlantic Monthly, and Annie Adams Fields wrote biographies. They were a very literary couple here. At this house, they hosted a lot of parties for their literary friends who would come and meet up. In fact, Louisa May Alcott stayed at this house for a brief period of time later in her life. Now, in 1868, a young woman, she was 18 years old at the time, Sarah Orne Jewett, who is right over by the window there, submitted a story to the Atlantic Monthly from her home in South Berwick, Maine. It was rejected, but she was encouraged to try again, and it's thought that maybe Annie may have influenced her husband James to encourage Sarah Orne Jewett to keep writing. Atlantic Monthly eventually published all of Sarah Orne Jewett's stories that were set in Maine and other stories, which were collected into a book called Deep Haven. And these stories feature two women in a relationship that is more than just friends, as it were, living in a house together in Maine and accepted by the community there. It is a fictional community, but still nice to think about that at that time. F.O. Matheson, who we just talked about, who was distantly related to Sarah Orne Jewett, wrote in a biography of her that she never expressed interest in heterosexual love. Now, he may have meant it perhaps more in a she just never wanted to get married kind of way, but I think we can accept that it was that she wanted to be with another woman kind of way. Annie and Sarah's relationship was founded again on letter writing. That's a really important thing for them, but also visits. Sarah Orne Jewett would come down regularly from Maine and stay with the Fields at their house here at 148 Charles Street. There you can see them a little more clearly what they might have looked like. When James T. Fields died in 1881, Sarah Orne Jewett moved in with Annie almost immediately. There's some speculation that James may have even encouraged their relationship, as Sarah began dedicating poems to Annie in 1880, or possibly even earlier. Poems that included lines like, "Did I think of the wretched mornings when I should kiss my ring and long with all my heart to see the girl who gave the ring to me." For the rest of their lives, they would travel together, vacation, take writing trips, until Sarah's death in 1909. and Annie lived until 1915. Now, you might be familiar with the term Boston marriage. That's often used to describe relationships like this one. It possibly originated with Henry James and his novel, The Bostonians, which came out in 1885 and was the story of two women who were in a devoted relationship to each other until one of them had to marry a man, because that's just what you do. He may have based this relationship on women like Annie Adams Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett, as well as his sister Alice James and her partner Catherine Loring. This term is sometimes used to describe any devoted, long-lasting relationship between women, ranging from business partnerships to explicitly lesbian romantic relationships. So sometimes it can be a little bit hard to tell exactly when and how it is being used. But regardless, a major component of these relationships is that they are gender nonconforming, in the sense that they allowed women to live with other women without relying on the support of a man in their lives. They were able to exist here with each other without the support of a man. Because of that, it means they often are associated with women who had some level of financial freedom. So in this case, Annie Adams Fields, her husband had money and had died, leaving it to her, and Sarah Orne Jewett had this profession of writer. But that also means we see them often among women who worked in social work. So the settlement houses were a place where you often find relationships like these. For example, Jane Addams, who was the founder of Hull House, the first settlement house in America in Chicago, had relationships with her co-founder, Ellen Starr, and a later benefactor, Mary Rosett Smith. Here in Boston, at Dennison House in the South End, the founders there are Vita Scudder and Florence Converse. And then Catherine Coleman and Catherine Lee Bates both paired up into these relationships as well. In the North End, a woman named Edith Guerrier, who ran a book stall at the settlement house there, and eventually went on to become the first woman to lead a branch library in Massachusetts, or in Boston, had a relationship with an artist named Edith Brown. I couldn't find anything specifically about West End settlement houses, but I think there are questions to be asked there, including about Eva Whiting White, of the Elizabeth Peabody House, who we know was married only very briefly in her life and then never married again. Her papers are in some of the local universities and libraries, but she kept a lot of her personal papers out, and so we might not be able to ever answer that question, but I think it is an interesting one to ask anyway. Now, these relationships were often believed to be chaste, which meant that they were sort of accepted in this time period. We know now that that was not true, but because of that, it goes with this changing development in psychology around the beginning of the 20th century that went from these relationships being very, not questioned, to situations happening like the one at the house you can see on the right, which is where we did stop on the actual tour, which is 105 Revere Street. It's just around the corner from 148 Charles, so very close by. And only shortly afterward, in October of 1918, an undercover investigation occurred at this house by the Navy. The Navy was very concerned around this time of World War I about the sailors and exactly what they were doing when they were on shore. This house was owned by a man named Lee Porter, and the rumor had it that men were either, or sailors in particular, were bringing men here to this house and after meeting them somewhere else, or coming to this house in order to meet other men. And the Navy wanted to see what the heck was going on, so they performed this undercover investigation. Testimony later on described drag shows occurring in this address, including men in silk kimonos, holding ceremonies where they cursed the police for harassing gay people. Lee Porter was arrested as a result of this investigation. He was found not guilty of sodomy in his first trial, but his second trial he was found guilty of running a house of ill repute. He tried to appeal by saying this was a violation of the double jeopardy clause, but it was denied, and he was sentenced to prison at the Deer Island House of Corrections for 2 years. In 1922, Lee Porter moved to Europe, and we don't really know what happened to him after that. Hopefully he was off in Europe cursing the police there, I guess, having a good time. I think these two situations are just sort of interesting to show how quickly things change over a short period of time in such close proximity here, going from Annie Adams Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett living fairly under the radar and happily having books about their relationship being written, to Lee Porter being really severely punished and feeling like he could not stay in this city afterward. Now, we will head on back up the hill a little bit to wrap up our discussion of Prescott Townsend, who we talked about way back at the beginning. He was the one with the raccoon skin coat. These properties, which you can see on the left here, 15 Lindell Place and 75 Phillip Street, which connected through the basement, were the only properties that he kept a hold of after the crash of 1929. This address, 75 Phillip Street, which is not the building you can see here, but the one behind it, was a really interesting one that, as it came up in my research, the West Ender newsletter, which is a publication that was printed by folks associated with the West End Museum way back in the early and even before days of the museum here. We had two folks who had written in to the West Ender newsletter to reminisce about Prescott Townsend and this apartment, but perhaps not for the reasons you might expect. The first gentleman, a guy named Alfred Cutler, only recalled that there was a business run by Prescott Townsend out of this address, and it was called the Jolly Roger, but he didn't know what happened there. And all he wanted to talk about was that Prescott Townsend had let him borrow a car overnight once, and he was really grateful to him for that. Ralph Saya, who lived next door at 73 Phillip Street as a child, wrote in to say that he remembered one day when he was playing with his ball on the roof of his apartment building, it bounced over onto the roof of 75. So he went downstairs, he knocked on the door, and no one answered. So he let himself in and was confronted by a naked woman who ran into the room and closed the door. And little Ralph Saya was so shocked, he didn't know what had happened, but wanted to let Alfred Cutler know that that's what was going on behind closed doors here. Now, we don't really know, I think, who exactly was running this Jolly Roger business, whether it was Prescott Townsend himself or whether he had rented out the space to someone else who was running it, or what exactly the deal was here. But that was what was happening around this time period. In 1943, Prescott Townsend was arrested for a, quote, crime against nature on Mount Vernon Street, which is just a couple blocks away. And he was also sentenced to prison in Deer Island House of Corrections. He was released on VE Day in 1945. Now, Prescott Townsend was also really well known for petitioning in the state legislature, which is just up the hill. If you know the big state house with the gold gleaming dome, that is the state where he was going whenever he could, starting perhaps in the 1930s. To petition the government to change the laws that were targeting toward gay people at this time. There's some speculation that maybe he was just being sort of placated to as a Boston Brahmin, and that they weren't really taking him seriously. But his activism was really the thing to remember here, that he was really a vocal person at this time. And that fed into the group that began meeting in his basement, the quote unquote first social discussion of homosexuality in Boston, which eventually became associated with the Mattachine Society, which is a group that had been founded by Harry Hay in Los Angeles. By February 1959, the group here in Boston had 97 people on its mailing list. But it's also around the time that they had sort of a rift between Prescott Townsend and the group. The group were more interested in it being a social club, and Prescott Townsend really wanted it to be a socially activist group. So there was a rift there, and they did have a falling out. But he did start the group here in the basement at 75 Phillips Street. In the 60s and 70s, as Beacon Hill and North Slope were removed from the West End neighborhood, Prescott Townsend was developing his theory of sexuality called the snowflake theory, and he was getting really involved in hippie culture of the time. He attended the first Pride Festival in New York City in 1970 on the one-year anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. But his house here, 75 Phillips Street, which you can't see because it burned down in 1971, and he died in 1973. I'll finish on him with this quote from Randy Wicker in 1994, who said, "Prescott's was a happy, full life filled with friends of all ages, sexes, and orientations. Through him, I came to understand that a gay person could live a vibrant and exciting life into old age, thereby greatly reducing my own personal terror of growing old." The important thing to remember about Prescott Townsend here is the community building that he was doing at this time, for worse or for better in some cases, but trying to create in the West End this space where people could come together. All right, that brings us to our last stop here, which is one maybe some of you Bostonians might be familiar with. We're here at 228 Cambridge Street, which was a bar called Sporters, also known as the West End Tennis Club. It opened in 1939 and became quote unquote officially gay in 1957. Its heyday was in the 1960s and 70s, and staff at the time attribute this in part to its location close to the Red Line, but also the fact that it was near where Scollay Square used to be. We'll talk about what Scollay Square is in a second. But the important thing about Sporters here is that it was discreet, and bars were a place where you could come and be open at this time about your sexuality when you might not have been able to in other parts of your life, other areas where you were. Sporters itself closed in 1995, but there is still a bar that operates there called the Hill Tavern that I will admit I don't know anything about because I didn't go there this summer. But maybe if anyone knows if it's a nice place, you could let us all know. Now, Scollay Square, which you can see in the photos here on the right-hand side, was a top-in entertainment district for many years. It was big with the sailors during World War II and became really popular as with the gay community post-war. But as you can see a little bit of on the photo on the right there, it was demolished in the 1960s to make way for Government Center. If you're familiar with Boston, you know that Government Center is a very controversial place now in both the architecture and, you know, what it all stands for. Am I right? Now it's thought that people who went to the gay bars in Scollay Square may have transitioned over to Sporters since it was so close by. Can't tell from these photos, but you can see Government Center from standing outside of Sporters, so they are really quite close together. And the gay community in Scollay Square and around it was definitely a factor in urban renewal. I hope you can see the headline there because it's quite a headline. There's this gentleman on the left here is City Councilman Fred Langone. He was the city councilor for the North End, and he had been on the committee to save the West End before becoming a city council member. He wanted to preserve the community for the immigrants. He did not want it to be knocked down. But when the South Cove, which is a neighborhood known as Bay Village now, was threatened in 1965, Fred Langone did not come to its defense. The South Cove was a neighborhood that also had a large gay bar population at this time. Boston's licensing board representative attended a meeting on July 7th, 1965 to try to renew liquor licenses for the gay bars in South Cove. And Fred Langone gave him a long lecture about why that would absolutely not be happening. Langone wanted to rid the area of, quote, hangouts for degenerates and homosexuals. He said, "We will be better off without these incubators of homosexuality and indecency and a bohemian way of life. I tell you right now, we will be better off without it, and if we accomplish nothing else, at least we will uproot this cancer in one area of the city." So definitely the LGBTQ plus community felt the effects of urban renewal just as much as the immigrant families in the tenements. And you can see as bars are closing in downtown and in South Cove, they are opening in places like Fenway and the South End, which are areas we do associate somewhat with the LGBTQ plus community today. So to wrap up here, obviously we haven't talked anything about post-renewal in this talk here, and there's a lot to be discovered and to talk about in the West End of the LGBTQ community history, including the Metropolitan Community Church, which held services in Old West Church, Massachusetts General Hospital, and protests during the AIDS crisis. Jason Collins played for 1 year with the Celtics. He is the first out gay player in any of the 4 major sports leagues in the United States. And Bullfinch Triangle was known for its gay bars in the 90s. We haven't talked about them at all either. There's also a lot of room for further research on the immigrant community, which I did not come across much of in my research this summer. That's probably due to a lack of letters or diaries that are not in archives, especially of people who aren't famous. But the West End Museum has a really wonderful relationship with a lot of displaced West Enders. And so if they are able to do any research, or if anyone comes forward with anything in the future, I'm sure they'd love to hear about anyone's experience growing up in the West End. And lastly, just something I thought was really interesting. I found a project as I was doing my research on a newspaper called the Midtown Journal. And this research project had gone through and tracked this Midtown Journal was sort of a scandal sheet, and they who ran from the 30s to the 50s. And they would just publish people's addresses when they were in court for crimes. And this research project had gone through and tracked all of the arrests for gay crimes, essentially, from the 30s to the 50s. And in that entire time period, there were no arrests, or excuse me, no addresses of people arrested in the core immigrant community of the West End. That part that was all demolished in the 1950s. Now, whether that means that people queer people who lived in the West End were so closeted at that point that they were not out experimenting and putting themselves in situations where they would be arrested, or whether they had all left the West End by the point that they were, experimenting with their sexualities, or whether it's just, what other coincidences or correlations there might be there. Something to look into in the future for sure. So I hope you've learned about some people that you may never have heard of before, and that you found them interesting and happy to get to know them a little bit better. That, I think, is everything I've got to say, but I'm happy to take any questions anyone has.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was amazing. I'm just gonna bring myself and Grace up to help facilitate questions. But everyone, can we give a huge round of applause for Emma? That was absolutely incredible. What a beautiful speech that was. Everyone, we can use all our reactions or chats, this one, so good. Really, really beautiful job, Emma. The whole time I was like, so many new facts. That was incredible. So just everyone, just to be mindful of everyone's time, we're after 8, so if you have to take off, please feel free to do so. Send Emma your best wishes on the way out. But for those of you who are around, let's stay on to chat for a few more minutes and ask any questions that we had. So Grace, while we're asking, so people, you can either raise your hand and come up and ask questions, or you can put it in the chat. Grace, while we're waiting for people to sort of step up, do you have any questions for Emma?
I was going to ask, it sort of dovetails nicely into what you were talking about at the end of your presentation, but for us at the West End Museum, is there sort of a research question that was most interesting to you that you would like to dig into or have us dig into in the future on LGBTQ plus history in the West End? One that you really wished you would have gotten to over the summer, didn't have time to, or something that really intrigues you going forward?
That is a good question. I think, well, Hmm. I guess so. It's not technically in the West End anymore at that point, but the gay community news was big on Charles Street. I found it on Charles Street, which is just on Beacon Hill there, and I was interested in maybe seeing, like, digging into that publication a little bit more and seeing how it maybe talked about the West End and events that were happening, if there was anything going on, after the renewal period. But the gay community newspaper was founded in, I think, 1973.
Mhm. And we have
Um,
the whole collection of gay communities in our archives, and we have several different like exhibitions on our website on our Omeka, which is our digital archives about gay communities. I just put one in the chat of like a visual history of gay communities, um, just for people to have reference. Looks
yeah,
like we have
and
someone who is a volunteer GCN in the chat. That's amazing.
oh, amazing. Oh, and I'd like to say thank you to, is it Stephen? I'm not sick. It's just a vocal fry thing.
um, Arlene saying you might want to connect with the Nichols House on Mount Vernon Street. They had gave tours last year on Bohemiana. Ooh,
Mm,
you did mention Bohemians quite a bit.
mhm. Fun.
So did anyone else from the audience, anyone have a question? You can raise your hand, or you can just unmute yourself and I'll spotlight you so you can ask a question, or you can ask in the chat if you have any questions. Arlene, yes.
Hi,
Please unmute yourself.
mine isn't a question, but I'll just add on to the Nichols House thing that in the course of the tour that they gave, a real life tour, not a virtual tour of the neighborhood, they were somewhat aware of who might have been gay, but it wasn't, GLBT, but it wasn't as extensive as what Emma was describing. And I think you all could really help them to do a better job. And they may have some insights that you'd find useful, particularly around Joy Street and some artisans that were there.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got a couple of questions in the chat from Stephen. Emma, did you come across John Lindquist, 1890 to 1980, in your research? Oh, those are really good life numbers. Sorry, he was a resident photographer at Jacob's Pillow and an actor with Catherine Huntington, who Boston Repertory's theater, the Huntington Theater, is named after her. Did you come across John Lindquist in your research?
I think I did, but I don't remember anything specifically. But the names are familiar. So I will have to go back and see where that came up. And if you know anything, please let me know. But I'll definitely, yeah, look into that.
Emma, what's your email address if people have any resources for you that they can send to you?
I can write that in the chat. It's just beckman.e@northeastern.edu. There's my email.
Please, everyone, send Emma all of your research. I'm sure Emma would love to know more. Susan wants to know, do we prefer the word exploring our sexuality rather than experimenting? And Jim suggests experiencing our sexuality. Do we all have any insights on terminology here? Not quite related to the history of the West End, but still a great question. I can jump in and say, I think experimenting, exploring, experiencing, whatever fits your narrative is good for you. And being less policey about language is the way forward. Doing whatever, letting people say what they want to say is the way, I'd say. Arlene has another question. In the insights into the Gobson house on Beacon Street, it's more Back Bay than Beacon Hill, of course, but Gibson was queer. Gibson, not Gobson. The Gibson house. Do you have anything about the Gibson house that you know about, Emma?
I don't know much. The funny thing is, I was supposed to go on their queer history tour tonight for a class, and I couldn't go because I had to come and give this talk. So if you had, if the dates had not quite lined up so as they did, I would be able to tell you more. But I will be getting there, as I say, for this class, for sure, soon. But I've heard it's good and that the exhibit is good. That goes along with that tour, the tour that they're doing. I don't know how late it runs though. It might be closing soon. like this month. But if you can get over there, you can let me know how it is.
Perfect. Well, I think with that, we'll wrap up this evening. Thank you so much, Grace from the West End Museum, for collaborating with us at the History Project. Emma, wow, just again, what an amazing, amazing speech that was. Now I need to come on. We're gonna have to do an actual real life version of this. That was really amazing. Now I need to go, I need to hear this all again on foot because like, I don't know, just the fresh air is going to make it sink in even better. So thank you so much again, Emma. And thanks again, Grace, for working with us. My name is Matisse. I'm with the History Project. And I hope you all have a wonderful night. Ciao.